Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Where Do We Go From Here? It's Imran Khan. I'm really excited today to have a very good friend of mine, Matthew Land, joining us in Miami, Florida. Matthew is the political director for the Southeast Laborers District Council, where he represents some of the hardest working men and women in construction. And I'm particularly excited to have Matthew here today because Matthew actually asked me to be part of the program because he's been working in labor for about 12 years, and given the not only the COVID crisis, but the crisis around some of the race relations and tension that's going on in America, he felt that this was something that was very much ripe to talk about. So Matthew, throw it over to you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing.
Thank you, Imran. Like Imran said, my name is Matthew Land. I'm the political director for the Southeast Laborers District Council, representing construction workers. I represent laborers on a job site from the very beginning to the very end. And they are some of the hardest working men and women in the construction industry that are literally building America, from your roads and your bridges to condo buildings and houses and doing many other things. But above all, we are a brother and a sisterhood that work to collectively bargain and fight for better and more fair wages, better and safer working conditions, access to health insurance and to retirement benefits. And it's vitally important, the work that we are doing in the labor movement, to continue to make sure that we have that, not only just for our union members, but it advances the conversation for the rest of America and for the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, and Matty, you told me just a second ago that you were likening, currently what's happening in terms of, some of the activism and protests with the labor movement, right? With what happens in terms, 150 years ago around fighting for, wages and a work week. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's the intersection between the Black community and non white people and the struggle that we've faced. We've seen for decades, and even right now, folks protesting, rioting for against police brutality and against the systemic racism that we're seeing. But the labor movement has been in the forefront of that from the very beginning. The reason why we have things like the 40-hour work week, why we have things like not requiring you to work on weekends, it's all due to the labor movement doing that. We have safer working conditions. We have, the Department of Labor and OSHA standards because of riots and protesting against unsafe working conditions. We have higher wages due to union members. That's literally why we have higher wages and access to healthcare, retirement benefits in the workplace. But for unions, if unions went away today, many of those standards that we see would go away as well. I think one of the things we've seen is the fight for 15, the notion to pay your workers a minimum of $15 an hour. Right. Unions have been fighting for that as well. And what we're seeing is if we didn't have unions fighting for that, employers, corporations would just pay their workers whatever they could, and it would just increase their own bottom line at the end of the day and make the CEOs and those in the C-suite just even richer. So
actually I think that specifically brings me to why I'm doing this program, right? To talk about how this current crisis with COVID really kicked off so many of these conversations, right? And I think labor unions are probably quite integral in the way that the government has reacted to trying to protect people and workers. So do you want to talk a little bit about how the labor movement has been a part of that conversation as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the construction workers that we represent, it's interesting because we are union members are used to having things like access to water, having access to personal protection equipment, and we think of PPE in the sense of masks and gloves and gowns and things like that, and the healthcare industry, the hospitals. But on a job site, it's no different. It's having access to boots, it's having access to the masks, it's having access to the garments to protect you from the sun and from the heat. But for, unions fighting for some of these things on construction job sites, we wouldn't be having them literally right now. We might have a contractor who might say, I'm just going to go and have a quick little shortcut and not provide these materials to my workers? Well, when workers feel unsafe, they've got a couple of choices. They can say, I'm going to say something to my boss
Mhm.
and I might get fired. But for that union contract, they likely would get fired. With those union contracts, though, you have those remedies to ensure that they have access to those, to that PPE on that job site. And specifically in Miami-Dade County, where I work, and some of the members that I represent, we've been
Mhm.
able to fight for those things and ensure that all of our workers have them. We're even training all of our members right now on an infectious disease course that every single one of them has to take before they step another foot onto a job site. So
Mhm.
they know that those things to look for. Not all contractors are doing that, but unions are ensuring that we're doing that. But not just in the construction industry. During this crisis, union members that are representing Unite Here represents hospitality workers in our
Right.
hotels, in our
Right.
restaurants, in our casinos. They are fighting for those exact same things for their housekeepers. And even as folks are starting to return to work, and we are creating or living in a society which is the new normal now, we're starting to see that workers are having to do more, but for even less. They're coming back at 50% occupancy rates, which means they can't bring everybody back on staff. But
Mhm.
yet those workers are still having to do those same jobs, if not even more so. Their job descriptions have expanded, but their wages have not.
It's really interesting you mentioned that. A very good friend of mine who was also already on the program, who talked about supply chain, said something very similar, right? Like some of the essential workers early on in the crisis were folks that were working at, let's say, like Amazon,
Mhm.
distribution centers, and there had to be some thought put behind about, well, how do we create safe working standards for people who are going to be in distribution centers, trying to get people who are stuck at home the vital things that they need to keep operating, right? And so, what have you seen in terms of construction or some of the folks that you represent that's been similar? Like, is there a corollary to that?
Yeah, there is. It's interesting. Construction workers start very early in the morning, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning.
Hmm.
If you are driving along a big job site, like let's say a big luxury condo building, a 20-story condo building, you will see workers lined up in the morning, and you will see the superintendent that is taking all of their temperatures via, the thermometer scan. They are
Wow.
all social distanced. They must have their temperature checked every single day before they go on the job site. They are required to have their certain amount of breaks. They are being given PPE. They're being given access to those materials to keep them safe on the job site. Even outside of the construction industry, here in Miami, we're seeing things like if a business wants to reopen and one of their workers becomes sick, that business must immediately shut down, and they must
Mhm.
test every single one of their workers, not just the one who became sick. But it's not only to protect their workforce, it's also protect those people that are their patrons that are going to that business.
Mhm.
So, again, in the construction industry, it's to protect the rest of the workers. For most of construction, it's not a scenario where you can do the work and not be close to one another.
Right.
Typically, you are helping out another, whether it's a laborer helping out an electrician with those materials, whether you're
Mhm.
hauling them together or moving them together. Some of the only instances in construction when you're able to really kind of work very solely is when you're doing highway work, which is very, spaced out and so on and so forth. But
Mhm.
but oftentimes you are doing that work in crowded spaces, and so you have to do everything you can to maintain the social distancing, wearing your masks. And let's face it, in South Florida, it's almost the middle of June. It's hot outside. It's
Right.
it's very difficult to be doing so and to work effectively. But the work still has to be done.
Yeah, and I think this is all leading to the second question I often, pose to folks on the program is, well, now that we understand that there's been this impact in terms of having to socially distance on job sites, providing the right materials, et cetera, what do you think is going to be some of the short-term consequences, long-term consequences, right? So if you think 6 months out, how is this going to change the way that construction is done, change the way that labor unions approach their bargaining for their union members, and then same thing, what is this going to look like in 1 year or 2 years, given that there might be second waves of the at least the COVID crisis. So I'm curious to get your perspective.
Yeah, so for the construction industry, as you looked at it nationwide, you saw certain places saying we're going to shut down construction completely.
Mhm.
And then other places it continued on. Across Florida, one of the things that we saw when we were practicing safer at home and, and not really leaving our homes was they sped up some of these construction projects, specifically some of the highway projects, which traditionally causes a lot of traffic jams and things like that, and a lot of frustration amongst, commuters in the morning and in the evening, right? When roads are shut down,
Mm-hmm.
or certain lanes are shut down. So if we see another kind of a spike in this, I don't expect construction is going to slow down. It didn't down here in South Florida, and it didn't really across the entire state of Florida. It either maintained its current pace or it kept up. Now, some of the things that did happen is, and that's specifically for projects that were already really kind of underway. There were a lot of projects that we saw being put completely on hold, whether those were privately funded or publicly funded projects, because it's a lot of unknown things in how to address the social distancing and providing for the PPE for those workers. And are we in fact putting them in more danger by requiring them to go to work, or are we still taking enough measures to ensure their safety?
Mm-hmm.
So as we look to what a second wave could look like, or as we continue in this, I would say, construction is one of those markets which, it does have slowdowns, and typically we see that in recession type markets. And while this is, a recession or even something even, more profound than that, construction wasn't hit nearly as hard as we expected that it could be, at least not here in Florida. So I think it will really kind of depend on the leadership of our elected officials and what they are saying needs to be done in order to, flatten that curve again. I think it's important to remember that flattening the curve was not about not getting people sick, but it was about ensuring that we had enough, room in our hospitals for those people that were getting sick, that were, so sick they needed to go to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as construction, it's going to happen regardless. It's just to what degree does it happen, and to what level it happens. If it's in the private sector, we might start seeing things where banks are unwilling to lend money to some of these projects because they are considered to be deemed too risky, because of it's too risky on the workforce to build them. If a project is supposed to take 12 months, that developer has to start returning its return on its investment, rather quickly, right? So they need to be able to sell those condo units. They need to rent out that, that commercial space. And if that project, due to social distancing, is now taking 18 months or 2 years, banks might not say, or they might start saying, we're not going to lend to you because we need that return on our investment quicker and sooner.
Mm-hmm.
But it's and then even in the public sector, it's interesting because a lot of local governments at the municipal level and state and even at the federal level are being hit very, very, very hard on their finances. And so we're seeing municipalities start saying, we're going to put these certain projects on hold for now. They aren't vital to this government performing its duties that are necessary to perform as a government.
Mm-hmm.
So we might start seeing parks not being renovated as quickly.
Right.
Water and sewer system is breaking down harder and faster because we're not repairing those pipes as quickly. So it could be a cataclysmic bomb that goes off, right? Of just a lot of things that are piling up. But at the end of the day, construction still has to happen. It can't stop.
Right. This leads me right into the last question that I often ask folks, which is, well, where do we go from here, right? Like, I mean, if construction's not going to slow down, I know you've already talked a little bit about construction pivoting so that there's more social distancing. There's definitely best practices on how to keep people safe. What do you imagine, like, if you're talking to policymakers, if you're talking to lawmakers, like what would be your advice to put out there to folks thinking about, not only how do you work with labor unions, but specifically the construction industry?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to policymakers, I mean, in my role as a political director for a labor union, I sit in various coalitions,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm working with one right now to develop a kind of a model template piece of legislation that can be used at the local level on best safety practices
Mm-hmm.
for the workers that are essential service workers, right? That are doing work for those cities and those counties, whether that's in the construction market or whether that's water and sewer employees or whomever whoever they might be. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're working to take that, shop it around and figure out how we can start implementing some of those practices, because there is no uniform across, the various municipalities or the states as far as what are the best practices to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we are working on right now, is promoting those best practices for safety for workers.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, though, I mean, I think that it's incumbent upon a lot of people to start getting involved and support the work that unions are doing. And there's so many different ways to do that. You do not have to be a union member to support the work that unions are doing. The AFL-CIO, which is the national umbrella of affiliated unions, has constituency groups.
Mm-hmm.
And there's various ones. There's the A. Philip Randolph Institute. There is the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. There's Pride at Work. There is the Latin American Council for Labor Advancement,
Mm-hmm.
LACLA. And so they are all geared towards, they're all affinity groups. They're geared towards, either Black people or LGBTQ people or allies. And those that support the plight of working people and the mission to organize those that are unorganized. And so I would invite folks to check them out and get involved. Currently I am also the president of the chapter in South Florida chapter of Pride at Work, which again advocates for LGBTQ members and allies.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we are doing is advocating for stronger protections, LGBTQ protections, and collective bargaining agreements. Oftentimes those are some of the first things that are bargained away. And why is that? If an employer is offering you a raise or LGBTQ protections, those LGBTQ protections are only going to affect a small subset of your union membership, whereas the wages are going to affect everybody. So one of the first things they bargain away are those types of protections.
Right.
There's a lot of things that unions are doing that will, again, how's the saying go? A rising tide lifts all boats.
Mm-hmm.
The work that unions are doing is going to lift everybody up. And so if more folks are willing to get involved and start having those conversations,
Mm-hmm.
and again, it all translates into politics. It's ultimately calling your elected council people, your commissioners, your state representatives, your assembly people, your United States senators, your Congress people, and letting them know this is what you believe in and you want them to stand up and do the right thing.
And this is such great advice. Like, I think it's super good. It's also the advice that Emily Town, the dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School, gave another person who was on the show. Just said, listen, vote, 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 right? It's our way of getting involved, as well as getting involved with the groups that are affecting change. And that's exactly what you're advocating for. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for your time, talking to me a little bit about how labor has been impacted during the current crises and how that's really impacted people's day-to-day, particularly in the construction industry. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being with me here today.
Absolutely. The last thing that I want to say is make sure you fill out your census. Go to my2020census.gov. Everybody needs to do that as well.
Absolutely agree. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Thank you.